Hello and welcome to the Business of the Business podcast. I am your co-host, JP Jampaj from the Two-Man Power Trip. And of course, joining me is my co-host, Mr. Trump Mania himself, the wizard, Mr. Lavi Margolin. Lavi, how you doing today, sir?
Hey, John, I was doing great. Just above me, there's some major construction that just began, so hopefully it doesn't affect everyone's experience today. But a special guest to start out with. We're so happy to welcome Andrew Marsh, a cinematographer from MegaCast Studios and one of the brains and creatives behind everyone's new favorite video game, Wrestlequest.
Hey guys, hopefully it's everyone's favorite. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, Andrew, what is going on with you? I know WrestleQuest is kind of kicking ass and taking names right now, but where did you kind of grow up, and were you a wrestling fan where you grew up?
So yeah, I'm born and raised in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Still living there. And yeah, I mean, so I'm 38, so I was born in the 80s, and so real young age into wrestling, right? Like back when like Macho Man and Hulk Hogan, those guys were the top guys. I was real into it around then. I was like 5 or 6 years old. Then I kind of fell out of it for a while. But then in like the mid to late 90s, I got back into it because I started watching WCW. And it was just so bombastic and crazy that I was just hooked. And I actually know I can actually tell you the exact moment I became a like lifelong wrestling fan was in 1998. There was a WCW pay-per-view sold out. The opening match was an 8-man luchador tag team match, and my favorite wrestler of all time is La Parka, or he goes by LA Park now. He was in there, and his team loses. So he's the chairman, so he gets in there with his folding chair and takes out the winning team one by one with his folding chair. Then El Dandy was one of his teammates. He gets in the ring to go shake his hand to congratulate him for taking everyone out. He starts taking out everyone on his own team one at a time with the chair, around the ring, and then leaves. And that was the moment right there where I was like, oh, this is great. This is like, I'm into this forever now.
Wow, that's awesome. What a interesting moment. I don't know if I've ever heard anybody mention that before. I love that pay-per-view. And I used to love LA Park, aka La Parka. He was the man, chairman of the board.
Yeah. He's my all-time favorite. I got to see him wrestle like about a year or two ago. It was great.
Wow, where at?
So there's a guy who wrestles down in CMLL in Mexico. I think he goes by Sam Adonis down there. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's what the name.
Yep.
Yeah, okay. So he's from Pittsburgh. And so every now and then when he comes home, he'll do a show here in Pittsburgh in like a little club, like a little local club, where it'll be like local guy, but then he'll bring some guys up from Mexico with him. And those will be like the big matches. And it's a great atmosphere too, because it's a club, so there's no seats. Everyone's just standing around the ring while they're putting this like insane like lucha libre show on.
I love it. So he brought in LA Park to Pittsburgh?
Yeah, he brought LA Park for he wrestled Gangrel in the main event.
Wow.
And it was brutal, man. Like that was like a street that went from like a wrestling match to a street fight, I think. Because like they had like the worked trash cans with all this like all the worked props in them. But like by the end of the match, they're grabbing just the actual trash cans from this place, like full of beer bottles and stuff, and just smashing each other with them.
I love it. We're seeing a little bit of a different La Parka than we're used to. I know he always used to kind of be hardcore and stuff, but yeah, he's definitely.
When he got a little bit older, he definitely moved more into like the Rudo style, where he's like a lot more like physical and like doing a lot more hardcore matches and stuff.
So did you always like Lucha Libre, or it's just La Parka kind of got you into it?
WCW really in general just kind of got me into Lucha Libre. They had such a great card for that. Like their roster was like all the greats of it. You know, he had like Psychosis, Eddie Guerrero, Rey Mysterio, like all of the greatest luchadors that any of us could possibly know were on WCW. And so like just seeing like that, all the high flying maneuvers and stuff, like that got me hooked on Lucha Libre.
When you look at it, though, I mean, that's kind of, a little different, right? Than you would think, as far as just getting hooked on to, somebody from the Northeast getting hooked on to Lucha Libre. I love it.
Yeah.
So as far as, becoming a fan, obviously you are, but what about a fan of video games? Did you have a favorite video game? Were you into that side of the fandom at all?
Yeah, I mean, so I was a kid of the '80s, so I grew up with the NES was my first console, and so gaming was always around. And then probably mid to late '90s again, my family got their first PC, and I got to play Doom for the first time, and I was blown away, man. I was hooked. Like that's what got me in, and it's what got me into the idea of working with video games too, because it was a PC game. You could mod it, you could make maps, you could change the art, you could do all that stuff. And so I started learning that a little bit when I was a kid, and I was getting real into that. Nowadays, I'd say I like playing with video games more than I like playing them.
What about wrestling video games? Were you into wrestling video games?
Oh yeah, I would say up until about 2012, I was a yearly release buyer every year. And then eventually I sort of like, okay, I can't be spending $60 on a wrestling game every year. So now I sort of wait like 3 or 4 years for like a big revision to come, and I'll buy that one.
Do you have a favorite wrestling game?
Favorite wrestling game? Oof. I like WWE 12. Like 2K12 was a good one. They had the universe mode, and that was insane because first of all, it hooked into every game mode. You could just be playing an exhibition match and tell it you want it hooked into the universe mode. And it got really good at like just generating storylines and stuff on its own, like in a really natural way. I remember I made the NWO, I made some other guys, and they just naturally did like a takeover eventually where they just started like having people heel turn and come to their side. It was wild. Like, yeah, I don't think anything's ever touched that.
I still love No Mercy. Remember that game from Nintendo
No
64?
Mercy's good. Yeah, No
That
Mercy's
was a good
great.
one. And even
Yeah.
WCW versus the World. I mean, there was
Mm-hmm.
they had some good games back in the day for sure.
Yeah, I think versus the World too. That was made by the guys that made Fire Pro, I think, or like some of the guys that made Fire Pro. So there's a lot of similar systems between the two, which is cool.
As far as Wrestlequest is concerned, when you're kind of developing that, what's that process like? Because you're a fan and you know your stuff and you're a fan of video games. So what's the process like of developing Wrestlequest?
So it was long. I mean, we've been working on the game for about 4 years. We say 4 years, but I mean, there was ideas for it longer than that. When we first started with the even base concept of it, it was a wrestling game. It was like a 16-bit like WrestleMania the arcade game style wrestling game that we wanted to make. But you played as toys, that way it could be like all silly and over the top stuff. And we could do like, spoofs on like real life guys. But Zach, our head of studio, who wrote the narrative for the game, he started writing like the storyline that we wanted to have in it. And as he started writing it, we realized like, no, this can't be a wrestling game. Like this needs to be much bigger than that. And so we realized that the story he was writing, that's an RPG story. And so we landed on that, and then we started looking at pro wrestling and the mechanics of our like JRPGs, like turn-based role-playing games. And we realized that there's a lot of synergy between the two. They're both very like over the top and showy when it comes to attacking people. So like in Final Fantasy you have this big cinematic attacks that you do, but in pro wrestling they're doing that in front of a live crowd. They need to make sure that the guy sitting up in the nosebleeds has the same reaction or same like experience as the guy sitting ringside, right? So everything they do has to be like real over the top. And so we realized that sort of synergized. Then we started looking at like wrestling game mechanics too, and how those synergize with it. So we have like the pin mechanics and what we called the height meter, which in a pro wrestling game, if you just keep throwing strikes over and over and over again, you lose the crowd and you're less effective. So we put that in WrestleQuest. So you can't do the same thing over and over and over again, or else you'll start losing your effectiveness in battle. But if you do a good job playing to the crowd, then you'll get bigger and more signature moves that you can use during the fight.
I love that. Definitely something a little different because you can just go along. Like you're saying, just do the same move over and over. It gets a little boring, but you can't get boring because the crowd's got to get behind you and they got to get into it.
Yeah, yeah, and we tried to work in as much of like the mechanics of pro wrestling as we could, so that there's that side of it, and the moves you can do in a fight is all dependent on that. You have certain wrestling moves you cannot do unless the crowd is at a certain level. Um, we also in larger battles have what we call the dramatic moment system, where we play around with the idea that pro wrestling is scripted and like the outcomes are scripted, and then there's always like certain spots that are supposed to always like that they know ahead of time are going to happen in the match, and so you have to do those spots. So you'll be like fighting in an actual wrestling match against someone, and there'll be spots where you have to like let him kick out after two, and like you have to stick to those as well.
I'll hand it over to Lavi, who's got a bunch of good questions.
So, as a an '80s kid, myself, who lost, well, we don't want to say lost, but made use of a good part of his childhood on the NES. Pro wrestling games were good, but I was all about the RPGs. So, which is better, Zelda 2 or the original Dragon Warrior?
I am such a big Nintendo fanboy, so I'm going to say Zelda 2. I love that game. It's like the black sheep of that whole series, but I love it so much.
Yeah, that's my my favorite one from there as well. So I want to make sure that we talk about a very interesting story from our friends at Fight, because Fight is actually in WrestleQuest. How did that all come about, and what does that mean?
Oh man, so that gets into a whole can of worms. It's real fun to talk about, which is how did we get everyone in the game? Because it's awesome that Fight's in there, and it's awesome to have these like current day entities that are interested and want to be a part of it. But we also have like the Macho Man Randy Savage in the game, and like Andre the Giant, and like these legendary wrestlers. And so I mean, it's just the content of the game is really geared towards. I tell people it's not a wrestling game; it's a game about wrestling, because the story is more about the behind the scenes of wrestling than it is about like over the top wrestling storylines. Like we play it out so it's all over the top, but it's all about like real wrestling stuff. Like the main villain, I'm not going to say it's supposed to be an analog to a real guy, but the main villain of the game owns this giant wrestling federation that's going through all the territories and scooping them all up. And there's like storylines about like guys who've been on the road their whole lives and have missed out on moments with their families and stuff. That's, I think, what really drew a lot of those guys in, is that we're trying to be really genuine about what the experience of being a wrestler is like. And they really resonated with that. And out of all the people in the game, the guy that was a huge help with all that was Jeff Jarrett. Jeff was with us every step of the way. And he was our gut check. If we were doing something about like, say, like the guy who's missing out with his family because he's on the road all the time, we'd give that to Jeff and be like, is this real? Like, is this what it's like? And he would tell us, he'd tell us if we were on the right track or if we needed to change something about it to like make it more genuine. And that helped out a ton.
So we're big Jeff Jarrett fans here. He's been on the show.
I am too. He quickly became my favorite.
And John's first podcasting guest many years ago on his flagship show. So did you were you trying to push for like Ellie Park to get in the game?
That was me. Yeah, that was me. He's in there because we all got to pick our guys, right? So like, we all had our round table and we got to pick our guys. I was like, look, Ellie Park's got to be in it, man. Ellie Park was funny too because his like side quests that you do, the storyline of it heavily involves his sons as well, and that was the deal. Like we couldn't have him if his sons weren't in the game, which was pretty wild. It was great that he did it for his kids. So that he refused unless his sons were going to be in it.
So there was backstage allegations of a whole rigmarole with MLW and his sons recently. So maybe that could be an inspiration for the next game if it wasn't. If it
I'm not
wasn't for
gonna.
this one.
I'm not gonna touch it because he's still my favorite wrestler.
So, can you give a better sense of like who's the team behind this, and especially like from the business side, like who negotiates with the estates of like the wrestlers who've passed, or of course, active or retired living wrestlers?
Yeah, so I mean, we have a huge team of guys. There's probably about 50 plus people that worked on WrestleQuest. But our core team members like myself, I do cinematics. Nate Flynn, who's our creative director. Zach, Zach Manco, is our head of studio. He did. I mean, WrestleQuest is really his baby. I mean, he wrote the whole story for that game. And then James Deegan, our CEO, he's the guy that was doing a lot of the negotiations with the estates.
So in terms of, oh, sorry, you go.
No, I was gonna say it was a wild ride doing all that because you go in the office one day and hear that Andre the Giant's estate was very excited about the game. You're like, what?
That's awesome, and I know that his daughter, I believe, is like on the scene in terms of like conventions. I think there was a in New Jersey recently, like a children of wrestlers panel, which it sounded really cool and probably
she's great.
And a nice
she's great.
way.
Everyone, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say a nice way to get to know, sort of like to learn more about your family from other people that have worked with them.
Yeah, and she was great. Everyone was. I don't think I've met a single pro wrestler that hasn't been a great person. At least a nice guy, It cracks me up because Jeff is like the all-time heel, right? Like he's very rarely ever a good guy. He is the nicest dude on the planet, and he can flip that switch so fast. We had a booth at StarCast, and so he was there signing autographs because he was there for Ric Flair's last match. He was also there for SummerSlam, and so he's like crazy busy that weekend. But I remember Zach and I were going up to his booth to give him some 8x10s of his character in the game for him to autograph for people, and it was like the beginning of the day. So him and Karen come in, and we're going up to hand him the 8x10s, and he's the heel in Ric Flair's match. So some guy way on the other end of the convention center boos him, and he just drops everything and rushes over and starts like getting in the guy's face and stuff. It was it's crazy how fast he can turn that on.
So a lot of fun. So one of the bumps in the road seemed like there was going to be a release date, and then there was a bug or something happened, and then it was pushed off. Just what was that process like internally? I'm sure a few people lost some sleep, but then you were back on the right
stressed
road.
Out. Little blood pressure raising. I mean, we don't want to put out a game that's gonna totally break on someone. If we have to take a little bit of a hit to put out a product that it was a major issue with saving the game. And so we didn't want to we'd rather take a little bit of a PR hit and delay it than put out a game that has like this major breaking issue in it. And so thankfully, the fans of the game and everyone very receptive to it. They totally understood. We didn't really have any issues with it. The people who are into this game have been great to us, and we're very thankful for it.
Being in the industry and looking at a company like AEW, start AEW Games, I think Tony Khan had an interview about this a couple of years ago, where at that year, I think the message was, if I understood correctly, we would have been profitable if not for the investment in AEW Games. So can having like a gaming division, like, do you think it's viable to have like, okay, we have a primarily pro wrestling company, now we have this separate division, or do you think it's so unique that it really has to stand on its own and have like a different culture?
personally speaking, I think that the best play is to have a licensing team that is very aware of gaming. And that's their focus, so that they can license games out to studios that have been around for a while and have like proven track records, and like, people they know are going to be able to release a solid product for them. I think that's sort of a pitfall that both AEW and WWE have fallen into, where they're trying to make these gaming studio things happen. And I mean, you look at, I'm doing some hot takes now, but you look at the WWE games, they just kind of dropped off eventually, and they got real into that yearly release thing, where it's just sort of the same game with a different roster every year for a long time. And then AEW games happened, and God bless those guys. I feel really bad for them, but it didn't go so hot. And so if a federation or a company like AEW was more focused on just having a licensing department that really understood gaming, I think they'd see a lot more success out of it.
So, sort of, where do you see the overall landscape of like professional wrestling gaming? Like, I remember years ago, when TNA came out with a game, just because there weren't so many wrestling games that would come out, it would just be like, oh, this is a huge moneymaker. Everyone's interested in it just because it's a game. And I think it's the same thing with like toys now. So many people are manufacturing pro wrestling toys that each doesn't stand out. So, what does it take to succeed, do you think, especially if you don't have a major license?
I think doing something different. I mean, no one would have, if I'm being honest, if we would have made that 16-bit wrestling game, I wouldn't be on this podcast right now. Like, no one would have cared. But we did something different with it, and that's what got people's attention. We did something different for wrestling fans. We did something different for RPG fans. And so that's, if you're not the WWE or AEW and you want to make a wrestling game, don't just make a wrestling game. Make something different. Make something different that involves wrestling, that uses wrestling mechanics, but don't make a wrestling game.
Awesome. Let me turn it over to John.
So, Andrew, how is the success of WrestleQuest? How's it been going? Has it been above and beyond your expectations?
It's been going pretty well. We have some really great fans out there, and we've had some really great fans at MegaCat, which has been fantastic. We have a great little community that we have, and it's always growing, and people just get so excited, and it's always great to see. Even going out and doing trade shows like PAX and TwitchCon and all those places, and having people come up to us and who know us, who've been playing our games for years now. It's a great feeling, and I think WrestleQuest is going to just continue to build off of that. We're going to have more fans and more people who got exposed to us and sort of know who we are. And it's a good feeling, because we're not making games for us. I didn't make WrestleQuest because I want to play WrestleQuest. I made WrestleQuest because I want other people to play it. And so, seeing that happen is always just a good feeling.
Now, as far as WrestleQuest, give us one last big push and where everybody can find it as well.
Yeah, so you can find WrestleQuest on every major platform. We're on Steam, we're on Xbox, PlayStation, Nintendo Switch, Netflix. If you have a Netflix account, you can get WrestleQuest. It's just part of your account. You can find us online, megacatstudios.com, or at Megacat Studios on every social media platform. And yeah, just go out and love the game, guys. The more people who get out and go and experience that game, the better. I want people to play the game. That's all I want.
Oh, and they have, and they will. Andrew, thank you so much for all the time. Check out WrestleQuest.
All right. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you, Andrew. Appreciate it all the time.
All right.
All right, Lavi, let's move on to the news. What is the latest from this? I guess it's a Joshi promotion, Sakuban.
the mysterious Joshi promotion. We're certainly learning more now. We know that the name of their limited liability corporation, which is Dream Slam Productions. They had registered their trademark in March, but nobody noticed it or found it. It was in Japanese, but also that no one knew what to look for because in the trademark it didn't reference pro wrestling. But the word is now out. They're going to have their first show in New York. I got my ticket. I'm very curious, as I've been talking about. So they're going to debut at the Capitol in downtown Manhattan. That's a venue that actually I've never been to before, surprisingly. It holds about 750 seated, about 1,500 if it's maybe a concert or standing event. So I know that they've had boxing there before. It might have been a club years ago. But Joshi Wrestling Company to debut in downtown Manhattan. First ever All Japan Joshi Wrestling in the U.S. brings Japan's top female wrestlers to a global audience. The first ever Joshi Women's Wrestling Company outside of Japan features an entirely Japanese roster, will hold its world premiere, featuring the strongest women's roster in North America. Harken back to the glory days of Joshi Wrestling to present the authentic, hard-hitting, phenomenal experience. There's a pretty cool anime video, almost, I would say, too good, in terms of like, so I'm not, particularly expert in Joshi, but certainly familiar with Stardom and all of that. So from what I understand, some of the talent is Stardom talent that's signed to like US deals, and they've been given different characters that sort of fit in an anime mold. So there's an animated video, which looks really cool. So this show actually sold out nearly immediately. It sold out in the first day for sure. The main event is Ichigo Sayaka, also known as Unagi Sayaka, versus Countess Sayori, also known as Sayori Anu. The winner will compete for the World Championship at their second event in the U.S. to be determined. The name is an ode to the girl gangs of the 60s and 70s that helped bring feminism to the forefront of Japan. They feature many of the world's best wrestlers portraying new characters that they've helped influence and create. The company's four stables, the Vandals, Harajuku Stars, Cherry Bomb Girls, and Dangerous Liaisons, will feud with another to reach the apex. The roster is contracted to long-term deals. So actually one of the most interesting parts to me, because these sort of things are never really promoted, is some of the talent, far outside of pro wrestling that they've signed, or not necessarily signed, that they're working with, and they've highlighted. So fingernail art by social media superstar Mei Kawajiri, Nails by Mei. Anime and manga art by fast racing artist and author Sakana Koji. Wrestling costumes and merchandise designed by world-famous creative director and fashion designer Olympia Letan. Hats created by the most important milliner in history, Stephen Jones. I have to look that up. That's a pretty, that's a pretty good tag name. Most important hat maker. Championship belt designed and created by the newest industrial designer of this generation, Mark Newson. I'm really curious to see what a unique belt style will look like. So I'm a little bit conservative about their success. From what was being talked about, it seemed like they were spending a lot of money. And they're really going for basically a totally new market, or growing a niche that something that is very niche here in the US, maybe to something larger, kind of focusing on populations that are interested in anime and manga, which is very big. So really curious to see what happens. I'll be nosing around at the show, seeing if I can get a sense of who the management is, but we'll certainly be following no matter what, and we'll have a live report of the show after it happens in a few weeks.
Nice. What about New Japan Pro Wrestling? Are they becoming irrelevant now here in the United States?
Yeah, so this was interesting when I was putting together my notes. First, I was like, New Japan, and then I was looking at like each piece of news, and I was like, are they really becoming irrelevant? So here's sort of my sort of like piecing together the clues. So when AEW announced Wrestle Dream, celebrating Inoki, I thought for sure that this would be like a co-promotion with New Japan. But I see that the way that they're promoting tickets, it just says AEW Wrestle Dream. And from what they said, they'll have some New Japan talent on it. But it's basically, from the way I'm looking at it, AEW kind of thinking like, we don't really need New Japan to be co-promoters of this show, which kind of changes the way that business is being done. Because look how successful the last 2 years in Toronto when they collaborated. So what foothold does New Japan have anymore at all in the US? Like, looking at their show, Sam's Town Live, October 28th. I'm not sure when tickets went on sale, I think recently, but most of the tickets are still there. And they're bringing in CMLL. So, yes, that has a certain appeal, and that worked for sure with New Japan, but I don't know if like A plus B, makes things bigger at this point. And then, like, it seemed like that they had a plan. Okay, the weekly strong tapings, for whatever reason, in terms of logistics, in terms of cost, that wasn't working, so we're going to do something else. But now Rocky Romero, who's basically the management face of New Japan in the US, is like, I'd like to bring it back. So, which way are they pointing? So just to get some quotes from Rocky Romero, I don't think Weekly Strong is dead in the water completely. I think that makes the most sense. If New Japan was to grow in America, the way America likes to do things, and say if we linked up with a channel or another streaming service or whatever, the US has more flexibility to do that than Japan does, to do stuff that, because we're kind of two separate companies. So I think that that's definitely a possibility. You never know with the writer strikes and things going on right now. This would be kind of the perfect timing to start pitching around a little bit and see if there's any interest. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be TNT or something huge like that, but I think that Strong could live on a small channel, similar to what MLW is doing, something like that. So, like, beIN Sports. I think that's my narrative. I think that would be great for Strong. Kind of have different avenues, whether it's SVOD, traditional New Japan World. You have 3 or 4 different ways to create income as well as production. The thing is, New Japan Strong Weekly was funded by World primarily, and sponsorship and other things. So I think that that's the next step. If we were to bring that back, and fingers crossed, that's one of my biggest things I'm probably going to try to be working on for the next year or so, which would be to bring Strong back. I just think it's too important to the growth of our young wrestlers and finding new talent for the future. From Fightful Summary, they also had a little write-up that said, Romero then emphasized the beneficial aspects of Strong, as he noted that it was helpful for storytelling. He did tell some of the obstacles they faced with booking the show. The veteran described how things change all the time, and taping shows in batches can make that especially challenging.
How are they selling ticket-wise, though? Like, are they doing okay as far as United States when they are coming here?
It just seems like everything is just down. Like, just a few months ago, right? We could say like, okay, you could bring in Sasha Banks and Moxley, and like you get your, no one else could do consistent basis that 2000s, but now, who knows where they'll go. And the lower profile shows like the Fighting Spirit in a Vegas casino, which, a lot of companies run at Sam's Town, like it doesn't look like they've moved much at all. And we looked at the 2300 arena, and that didn't move much at all. And of course, we talked last week about Bushiroad's stock price. So struggles ahead, especially like if you're having struggles overall as a company, if you're trying to support something else overseas.
Interesting. I just felt like they had some momentum. Maybe then they lost some momentum, but regardless, maybe AEW has definitely been effectively hurting them for sure.
Yeah, and every to stand even for AEW, right, their secondary and I don't know if you'd say third dairy, right, their third flagship shows on TBS or TNT, right, those are struggling now too. So I think unless it's like a top brand, a show or and brand like Dynamite, for people talk about challenges, but I think they're doing pretty well. and then SmackDown and Firstly, and then Raw, like every other show, is suffering a little bit. Although we've seen a bit of a rebound with Impact on Access.
So with Impact Wrestling, how are they doing right now? Because they've got a big show coming up, right? A couple big shows coming up.
Yeah, so there's the double taping at the Westchester County Center in White Plains, New York, which is actually in my neck of the woods. Not close enough, unfortunately, for me to make it there on Saturday night. Although I kind of love to with this thousand episode show, and the convention seems great. Like it probably isn't that busy, and you have like all these talents there. County Center is one of my favorite places to go, so I'm sad to miss that. But they had a limited number of reserve seats, maybe 8, 10, 12 rows deep, and those have moved pretty well. So curious. Well, on Friday, lower profile, like I don't know if you call it pay-per-view or special event, still has more tickets left than the 1000th show, where the reserved scene almost sold out. But then there's a huge amount of general admission, depending what they open up, because the county center could hold about 3,500 to 4,500 for pro wrestling, depending on the setup.
So Will Ospreay will be coming to Impact Wrestling too, right? Coming up. So it seems like maybe loading up a little bit over there at Impact.
Yeah, like we talked about last week, it's hard to tell. Like, are they spending money? Are they saving money? So we'll know by, let's say, Q2 of 2024 where they're pointed. But I think it's smart, especially, when you're in the UK and you have a star of that caliber that's available to bring him in.
What's going on with NWA and Billy Corgan? I'm reading that they're going to have better production value or different production or upgrading. What's the latest?
Yeah, so beginning with the previous Tuesday show, that was from their Chase tapings, that the show had a different look. It was like a quasi studio look that I would say, it was hard to tell exactly, but I would say like just one of the four sides of the ring had fans. So you can have like a little bit, depending on how many people go, a little bit of a deeper row there. And then the other side is that studio look in watching the show. And it looked like that they didn't show like full entrances, like the performers would come out and then they would like clip to the match. That might have just been the matches that I saw, but for what they are, for the NWA, I think that they work best with the studio look, and I think that the studio look that they developed, looked fine. If this is how they want to move forward, it's not a bad look for them.
Interesting with NWA. Maybe they needed to upgrade a little bit here, but what about the reality of wrestling? Speaking about upgrade, they got NXT talent coming in. Charlie Dempsey, who is the son of William Regal. I mean, what's going on with them? I guess Booker T and that relationship is kind of flourishing after all.
Yeah, I think like Booker T is like the most clickbaity commenter in wrestling. It's always like when I go to news, it's like, what did Booker T say about it? Like even ahead of like Eric Bischoff and Jim Cornette. So I think it's a win-win all around. Like you want to get some talent, out of Florida. But you want to work with like companies that you respect, or like a little bit in-house that you could be careful with, that the rings will be clean and that'll be a professional operation. And for Booker T, you bring in a national brand like NXT and have some different talent there. It's just smart business, I think, all around. This show, The Next Chapter, it's sort of like, it's hard on the reality of wrestling. They don't give a lot of news sometimes. So like on their website. So I'm not sure if this is like a new training center or venue that they're in, a new address. Maybe it like all corresponds with that, but that was like the sense that I was getting. And thanks for mentioning that with Charlie Dempsey. I was like looking at the picture. I was like, I know that William Regal has a son that's part of the system, but I was like looking, I was like, this guy looks so familiar, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Now that makes sense as I'm looking at the promotional poster.
Yes, William Regal's son. And then obviously Axiom is going to be there as well. So a bunch of NXT guys getting out of that NXT system down there in Florida and get out there on the road and wrestling, which could be good and beneficial for them for sure.
So of course I can Google it or Wikipedia it later, but now you got me curious, John. With your knowledge, do you know who Axiom is? I don't know. I'm not familiar with him.
A-Kid. He was a big wrestler. I believe he is German. I know he had a few awesome matches. Oh no, I'm sorry, not German, Spanish. I know he had a bunch of great indie matches as a kid, and that kind of like got him noticed like big time. I think Meltzer gave him 5 stars if I'm remembering correctly. I think he was in PWG, but A-Kid was his name on the indie scene, and he came to NXT. He was part of the UK NXT UK stuff. He was a part of the regular NXT, and then they repackaged him as Axiom to kind of give him more of that WWE flavor, if you will.
Nice, thank you. From the picture, it looks, and I don't mean this to shade him at all. It looks a little bit like that Quang look. You know, when you're a bigger wrestler and you have like a mask, and it's sort of like that partial mask, or maybe like a little bit like Ninja Mac to me. But that's just, that's just the generic look. So definitely curious.
As far as Tri-States Wrestling is concerned, what is going on with TSW?
So, not necessarily setting the world on fire, but I'm sure they're doing fine. I just came across this, and it just made a lot of sense, and it was just like curious, like, oh, okay, why aren't more companies doing this? So, their Marsh is the only consecutive day touring independent pro wrestling company in the United States, and they're doing 4 shows in October in Missouri with Simon Gotch and Warhorse as some of the main stars. It just seems like, not necessarily wasteful, but like, not effective the way that independent wrestling that brings in talent works. Like either somebody flies in, or they drive a good distance and then like they leave. But when you book 4 shows, you sort of have that economies of scale, especially if you're bringing talent from the outside. So right, 1 plane ticket in, 1 plane ticket out. Maybe if they need hotel rooms for 3 nights, maybe you can work it out with a chain so that if they're not returning to the same hotel, that it's around the loop. Rental cars, coordinating promotional materials. It just makes sense. I know that, what was it, in the company that runs in Queens, in the brewery with like Crowbar regularly. Last summer, I remember they were doing like, it seemed like they tried like 3 shows in a row, like around the New York area. It's a hard thing to do, right? Just promoting 1 show, everything that goes into it. But
Outlaw
I think it's
Wrestling?
yes, thanks, John. And I just think it would be like, if companies can make this work and make money, it just makes sense. We know that it's tough to do, right? Like Smoky Mountain Wrestling tried it and did well for a while. ECW certainly, I don't think they could run 4 shows because it was just too taxing. Maybe they did once in a while, but usually 3 was more than enough. But like, where you have that and you can like be in a certain base and like make a loop, sort of like the old days, just to keep the costs lower.
So as far as female executives in wrestling, are you thinking that they're under more scrutiny in pro wrestling, or what do you think?
Yeah, so this is something that's been on my mind for a while, even before recent controversy, which we'll get into. In reflecting on it, like a Dixie Carter, right? Like for, and analyzing it from an outside business perspective, there's certainly some things she did right, and many things potentially she did wrong. And the leadership of Stephanie McMahon, I don't think people are too critical of Jeannie Buss at WoW, just because it's off the radar. We probably talk about her and that company more than anyone else, and we're not necessarily critical of it. But I feel like, as compared to men in executive positions, people are a lot harsher, and we sort of saw the ugliest side of that this week with Jim Cornette maybe not smartly saying a lot of things that are unsubstantiated about Megha Parekh, if I'm pronouncing her name correctly, especially being given the fact that she's not only Harvard educated undergrad, but she's a Harvard lawyer who's worked in big law and is senior vice president and chief legal counsel for the Jacksonville Jaguars. Just because her name has come up in the news, she's certainly not as I would think, a public figure. So to talk about her at all without knowing the facts is just not a smart thing. A lot of people have said that. I'm not the first one to do that, but it's interesting that Christopher Danielson, certainly an executive at AEW. Well, I'm not sure if he's an executive, but in a management position. I've kept my mouth shut about a lot of things in this past year, but the unsubstantiated garbage I've read in the past few days about AEW's chief legal officer is an embarrassment to anyone spouting it. Absolutely the last person who should be maligned in this situation. And interestingly, like, people are like, well, why is she qualified? Like, I don't think there's anyone else more qualified, especially on the legal side, to do this. Who has these credentials. So just a note about something that I've noticed as a theme. I went back and I found a tweet in February where I was talking about whatever the controversy is at that time. I think it was with one of the WWE board members and management that had left, and just how maybe they were getting maligned in a very different way. But something to continue to keep in mind, like sort of like wrestling, it rears its ugly head in some ways. And I think that's true in a lot of industries that have sort of felt male dominated for a while, like video games has had cancel culture type of events, and comics gate in comic books. So when we think that we've gotten certain places, like, it could all roll downhill, especially with boomers that want it to be a certain way, and are not necessarily hiding their feelings, are very open about them often, but then it just explodes on the scene. So it creates an environment, unfortunately, where women and people that maybe have felt excluded in the world of wrestling because of its culture for so many years, like, sort of have to be even more cautious or careful, because there's people championing this type of language. And not to put it in a crass manner, but like, at the end of the day, males in wrestling often objectify women, and then claim that they're interested in male talent, and that's what it's all about, and so on. It's like, it's something that's often made up, and it's indefensible, right? Like, if you make something like that up without any facts, how do you like defend yourself in terms of proving that there's nothing to it, because there's nothing to go on, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, where did that come from though with her? Like, what? Like, I know she was there during the original brawl out, if you will, but where did that like come from with her and the Bucks? And like, it was kind of strange. She's just like the head of legal. I think she was just there. Maybe I'm wrong on this, but I think she was just there to try to like make sure nothing was happening. You know what I mean? I don't think she was trying to stir it up.
Yeah,
Probably trying to do the opposite, right?
Yeah, and it's like, I think that she happened to be accompanying the Bucks when they went into the locker room in the original situation, and people getting bitten. I'm not sure if that's allegedly. I think people admit to that allegedly. But I didn't, as far as I know, I don't think she had anything to do with this, except that Tony Khan said he said he consulted outside legal counsel, so I'm sure she was involved. I don't know if she was on this committee. It seemed like more was like Tony Schiavone. I wasn't sure if that was like for real or whatever that was, but I'm sure as vice president and legal counsel that she was involved in it. Interestingly, though, I just, in preparing for the show, I popped on to LinkedIn to check out her profile. So it still has her active as vice president of Jaguars, a role that she's had for many years. But AEW, there's like an end date. It says 2019 to 2020. So I don't know if it was just easier just to like just do everything under like a Jaguars umbrella, and yeah, AEW is included, or if that meant anything at all. But I was just curious to see that, because I just assumed that both would be listed as active.
I was just surprised to see her name keep popping up. Certain things, I thought something happened, or something was going on, but just odd that she was kind of brought up. I know, obviously, we're talking about lawyers and Punk might sue and different things like that, but I don't know. I was just surprised to see her name pop up as much as I've seen it pop up.
Yeah, and she was on one like sort of like off the radar podcast several months ago where I think when she didn't talk about Punk, but it was like when he was in that like, you know, neither here nor there sort of status, but seemed like a really interesting person. And I was going to pitch her on this show, but I don't think she'll want anything to do with any pro wrestling media for a while, just to kind of like stay away from the crazies. Not that we have any crazies following us, but just sort of like grouping it all in a bucket. Like, why does she need that in her life? She's a very successful person, I'm sure, in a number of ways. And like this fanboy, quote unquote, and not to diminish it, but like that sort of thing. Like when you have actual things going on, you don't need this garbage.
Man, what a wacky world of wrestling and craziness is always surrounded AEW. But as I'm reading, there's somebody behind the scenes at AEW saying the dark cloud has been removed. So we'll see if that means that they're on the better path now over there in AEW or not. It remains to be seen.
Yeah, I think like they have to look at the root of the issue, what allowed it to foster, and I think like to the way Punk was gaining so much power to allegedly to send people home and like you can work on my show, your management, but you can't even be here now. Like that was just a disaster. So even if they have to go back and the rating is 100,000 people less or whatever it is, I mean, you don't want to be canceled, but like to build back up without that, I think is very important.
All right, we covered a lot of great stuff. We had Andrew from Wrestlequest. So let's hit the plugs. You follow me on Twitter and Instagram at 2Man Power Trip. Check out the website, tmptempire.com. Lobby, what do you got?
So first of all, thank you to our friends at Fight, all of our friends at Fight, for helping to facilitate this introduction. Again, Fight appears in the WrestleQuest game, so everyone check that out. But check out my Twitter at Laviemarg, LAVIEMARG. Check out my long form articles on LionCubJobSearch.com, and check out our growing LinkedIn group, The Business of the Business Pro Wrestling Industry.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. See you right back here next week for a little business of the business. See you next week, folks.